Hi, this is Dr. Scott McMahon, and you're on Medicine and Miracles. It's a podcast where we talk about medicine and we talk about miracles. Today, we're going to talk about chronic inflammatory response syndrome again, and we're going to look specifically at the respiratory systems. There are three different symptoms that we find from the respiratory system. I might get caught saying symptom or system. Forgive me if I do, but there are three symptoms in that system we're going to talk about today. One of them is congestion, one of them is chronic cough, and then the third one is shortness of breath. So let's dig in right now. For congestion, people who are exposed to mold can have congestion for a number of different reasons. One of them is they could just actually have mold allergies. That's based on a form of antibody called IgE. That's big I, little g, big E, and that can cause you to have nasal congestion, watery eyes, red eyes, etc. A second thing that can happen is you can have actual direct irritation from the mold as it goes into your nose. Now you've got hairs and mucus and stuff like that. And the purpose of those is to keep the stuff that you breathe in, the particulates, the fleas and other things that might go in your nose from going all the way back down to the back of your airway and down into your lungs. So you have a number of different systems to try and slow stuff down, to filter out big particles. And you can have direct irritation from molds or fragments of molds as they rub up against the lining of your nose, what we call the mucous membranes. And so that can lead to you creating more congestion in your nose. A third thing that can happen is you can have extra histamine release. Now, we mentioned allergies before, and allergies release histamine, and that's why you take an antihistamine like Benadryl or Claritin or something like that. But you can also have just extra histamine release without the allergic response. And when that happens, your blood vessels start getting larger and more engorged, and you end up making more mucus. And about 80% of patients who have chronic inflammatory response syndrome will have an elevated level of C4A. We've talked about C4A before. It's from the complement system. But that C4A then causes you to release more histamine. And so as a result of that, you get the boggy nose and you can get extra mucus. And that's where congestion comes from. Now, chronic cough isn't cough because you have allergies. And it's not cough because you've got a cold or cold symptoms or something like that. This is just a cough for no apparent reason that happens over and over and over again. And I've seen patients who had chronic cough for like 4 years. And then we started them on treatment and their chronic cough went away. Can you believe that? Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So why would people get chronic cough? Well, again, it can be from allergies, which we've already talked about. It can be from direct irritation. It can also be from histamine release. And by the way, up to 40% of chronic inflammatory response syndrome patients talk about having some excess histamine type symptoms. But there are other things. Remember, you're making all this extra congestion for those reasons. Some of that might drip down your throat, what we call postnasal drip. And that can give you a reason to have extra cough. And then also some of these contaminants of your air, like little itsy bitsy microscopic fragments of old dead mold spores and other things. Some of those can actually go all the way down to your lungs. And if they do, they can become an irritation there and they can cause you to cough. Or you can make extra mucus there, or you can trigger asthma if you haven't, or you can even cause asthma. So there are a number of reasons of why people get chronic cough. And then the last one is shortness of breath. Now, this isn't shortness of breath like when you're talking, although you'll see some people have to take a breath every word or two. That's definitely shortness of breath, and that's a more severe form. What I'm talking about is if you start to exert yourself, like maybe you walk up one flight of stairs, and when you get to the top, you are winded, like you have to catch your breath. That's not normal. And it doesn't have to happen all the time, but the truth is it shouldn't happen at all. So if you get that, then we have to worry. Now, what are some reasons that you can get that? Well, all the things that cause a chronic cough can cause that also, like allergies and extra congestion and direct irritation, but they're very unlikely causes. More likely in someone who has CIRS is you get capillary hypoperfusion. We've talked about that before. That's where the blood, as it gets to the end of the circulation, as like the end of your fingertip, and then it wants to turn around and go back towards the core of your body. Well, if that blood gets slowed down, then you're not dropping oxygen off at wherever you're supposed to be at the tissues. You're not dropping it off very well or as quickly. And so your cells can actually run out of energy because of that. Okay, so that's one reason. Another reason is molecular hypometabolism. And we've talked about that. That's a transcriptomic test, also known as Gini. The Gini test can show us if you're making enough proteins in your cells to actually be able to make the optimal amount of energy for every molecule of glucose that you break down to make energy. When you're doing it right, you make somewhere between 36 and 38 molecules of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That's the currency of energy, ATP. But if your mitochondria is not working right, or you can't get the resources into the mitochondria, you only make 2 ATP for every molecule of glucose. That's 5% as efficient. That causes chronic fatigue. It can also cause shortness of breath, particularly if you're exerting yourself. And then the last thing that I mentioned is called pulmonary hypertension. Pulmonary hypertension is a bad actor. You don't want to get this, but it's relatively common in CIRS patients. First, you start with what we call proliferative physiology. We're getting a little complicated here, but it's going back to you're only making 2 ATP for every molecule of glucose. But for some reason, your cell is choosing to do that all the time because it's fast, but you run out of glucose pretty quickly. And then as a result of that, you end up going into anaerobic metabolism, and that causes you to make lactic acid, which then builds up and you get a pH change, and it's terrible. And it's hard enough when you're just standing there and doing your podcast, but it's so much worse when you try to exert yourself. Because if you're running in place, you're using about 10 times as much oxygen. And if you're already kind of compromised on your ability to do that, well, that's a problem. So the good news is that if you have CIRS and you have any of these symptoms, all of them can be made better or even completely reversed by treatment. And that's awesome. So remember, we just had the CIRS X conference. It was amazing. If you missed it, you really missed out on maybe the best one we've ever had. But you can still go to CIRS X and you can still download the files. You just have to pay a fee, but you can still see all the meetings that happen and all of the teaching that happened, except for the optional meetings. It was amazing. It was wonderful. I highly recommend you do that. Now, if you're looking for a doctor to help you treat, there's an interactive map on surviving mold, but check out moldco.com, moldco.com, where we can get you in with direct to consumer services in, at this point, select states, but by the end of the year, we're hoping in all states, and get immediate access to care. And then finally, I guess it's not finally, we now sell merch. Can you believe that? Is that a good looking water bottle? We now sell merch at the merch store at medicineandmiracles.co. So check that out. And finally, we're going to have another annual meeting next year. So keep your eyes open. We haven't picked the place yet, but we're this close. And come next year to the CIRS X annual meeting. Okay. Every week when we do this podcast, we talk about a miracle that I've been involved with or someone I know has been involved in. And this one, to me, was pretty amazing. There was a patient who came to my house. When I first started doing CIRS work, I had a full-time job all day long. And at night and on weekends, I would see CIRS patients at my house while I was learning how to do this. So this fine lady came in 2010 with her husband, and she couldn't even walk up the steps. 3 steps from the grass level of my house up to the porch level, which led to the front door. She had to be assisted by her husband and by me. And she was gray and ashen and she looked awful. She really looked awful. And if I recall right, this was about the fall of 2010. Now, this was a school teacher and she was in her mid 30s and she looked awful. And of our 37 symptoms, she had almost every single one of them. This had come on fairly acutely. She looked like she was just ready to get into bed for the next couple weeks. So we went ahead and we did the visit. We got the blood work. We saw that she had chronic inflammatory response syndrome and we started her on cholestyramine and she got somewhat better. And that was great. But what really changed is she had I skipped a step. Yeah. Over the Thanksgiving holiday, she had carpet in her classroom that was wet. It was always wet. It was like you could put your hand on it, squishy wet. And she had windows that were getting condensation, and that condensation would drop and drip onto that carpet. And there were 4 little girls who were my patients in my pediatric practice who were getting headaches 2-3 times a week when they were in this classroom. Well, anyway, over the holiday, the school district ripped that carpet out, and come the next week when school started again, those little girls weren't getting headaches anymore. So don't tell me there's no environmental illness, because I've seen it with my own eyes a couple thousand times. Well, anyway, having taken the medicine, cholestyramine, and having that moldy, wet carpet removed from her room, this lady was doing better. But when she really got better, was a spiritual thing happened. She started reading a book that was written by a pastor who has a healing ministry. It's called A More Excellent Way, Spiritual Roots to Illness. And she read through that, and she read the chapter on environmental illnesses, and she started doing what it suggested to do in the book. And within another month, she was completely healed. Like, she could now go into moldy buildings and not have any problems, which is not typical for patients that go through the medical care only. But she had a spiritual experience and she was healed, and she told me she was healed. And I ran into her, maybe less than a month ago, and I was chatting, and she's still healed. And this is now almost 15 years later. So glory to God, because only God can do that. But he brought her a healing miracle. And so now we're going to transition into our moment of hope. And today we're going to talk about Luke chapter 1, verse 13. Now, this is the story of how Messiah came. And the verse we're going to talk about says, "But the angel said to him, 'Do not be afraid, Zacharias, for your prayer is heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call him John.'" Now, they're talking about John the Baptist. And Zacharias was one of the priests at the temple of the Jews, and he served in the temple, and he was old, and his wife was old, and they'd never had a child. In fact, they would say that Elizabeth was barren. Barren is a terrible word, because you're supposed to be fruitful and multiply, and that was felt to be like a curse if you didn't have kids back in that time, in that day. My goodness. So here you have 2 old people. She's well past menopause, not physically capable of having a baby. And the angel talking to Zechariah says, "You know what? You're going to have a baby." Yeah. And guess what? Like a year later, they had John the Baptist as their baby. Wow. Isn't that amazing? I want you to understand that as long as there's a God, there's hope. No matter how long you've been praying, no longer how long you've been waiting for your prayers to be answered, your prayers can be answered. And in a minute, all that waiting will just be, will give way to amazing rejoicing. And that's just the way God is. And you know what? One other thing about that, when that angel came and talked to Zacharias, he knew Zacharias' name. He said, "Don't be afraid, Zacharias." And he said, "Your wife Elizabeth is going to have a baby. He's going to bear you a son, and is going to call him John." You know what? The angels know your name, and God in heaven, Jesus, they know your names. And if that's not something to bring you hope, I don't know what is. So that's it for this week's Medicine and Miracles podcast. Come and join us again. If you learn something, if you like something, hit like and subscribe. And just remember that this is the place where the mysteries of the human body, we find them intersecting with the unsearchable God. That's all. I'm Dr. Scott McMahon. Thank you. God bless you. Bye-bye.